Yeah, thank you. Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure and honor to be with you. I do these talks quite regularly, but they're more general introductions into the subject, and this one is actually quite a specialized one, and I feel it's also one that you probably won't hear so much anywhere else, because it's an amalgamation, an integration of many disciplines. My background, myself, I started working with the mind, outer states of consciousness, and plants and other ways to do it. Professor Thomas Roberts calls it psychotechnologies, at the age of 13, and explored various avenues to that. But what I found is important that while the focus was on the shamanic work always, it's also to understand more the mysticism side of it. You know, how do you translate all of this very earthy, very lower energy into the higher systems? You know, into the ancient systems of the Vedas, the Kabbalah, and the Sufis. What I've done also on the side, and this is why you know, who likes labels? You know, I mean, sometimes if people call me a shaman, I don't say no to that, because it helps people to understand that part of the work I do is of shamanistic in nature, and I work with these energies and plants and whatever shamans do. But I wouldn't primarily call myself a shaman, because I use shamanism as part of the tool in the toolbox of my methodology of working. There's a lot of ancient mysticism schools that, you know, and it's almost like it's like comparative philosophy. When you look at all of these systems, trying to understand what are the commonalities between all of those, where do they differ, why do they differ, maybe a cultural thing, or is there really a fundamental difference existing, or is it just, when you look at, for instance, Hinduism and Buddhism, the difference between rebirth and reincarnation is more kind of a semantic one rather than a real difference, you know, because it's just a difference between the no soul, and all that actually also is, in my point of view, more semantics than anything else. They really all mean the same thing. So if you put the semantics aside, you see that all of these esoteric teachings, they kind of converge and show the same thing, and that's quite interesting. Now to see how that works with the consciousness and with the plants is quite the next step then. Like I said, I started quite early on to explore, you know, first of course my own consciousness, and then at the age of 15 I started in a structured context to hold ceremonies for other people already. And since then have been on and off working in that facility, and on the side, you know, studied various systems of philosophy as well. I think to start off with, it's good to understand that while the exoteric or the physical world is kind of easy to understand, you got the yin and the yang, or the two complementary rather than opposing energies that form the whole. You know, you got day and night, you got the hard and the soft, the wet and the dry, you got the male and the female. And all of these things, they are very much the same. You know, a man and a woman are kind of almost the same. 2 ears, 2 arms, legs, you know, the whole works. But, as everyone in this room knows, nothing could be more different than a man and a woman, right? So this is what you see when you have these complementary parts that form the whole together. You know, day and night are also very different. You know, it's not just that it's dark and bright. There's so many energies that change, but then they are the same thing. There are different expressions of the same thing. So, and it's the same with all of these. And so they together form the whole. Now, you see this filtered through into physical reality, of course, because these systems are derived from observation. I'm a scientist by nature. By the way, I studied chemistry and physics and medicine as well. So my approach is very scientific, but at the same time, because on the non-academic side, I studied a lot of philosophical systems, it's interesting to see how that all integrates and really is all the same. So not just in these concepts that we have of, you know, the complementary opposites or the complementary parts, but you see also in the human body, for instance. Our body is split in 2 halves, you know, and every organ comes in pairs. You know, the liver and the spleen are complementary, but then you got the lung parts, you got the heart, which has 2 parts, 2 chambers each, everything, and the brain. The brain comes in 2 hemispheres. And the brain is interesting because with the other parts of the body, we could say, well, they're just mirrors of each other. Maybe they do the same thing. You know, anyone who knows traditional Chinese medicine knows that they are not just mirrors of each other. They're completely different. Every organ has its own personality. But in the brain, it's even in Western science and medicine accepted that the brain the hemispheres of the brain are not just two sides of the same thing. You know, the left and the right hemisphere are completely different in what they're supposed to be doing and what they are actually doing. So they're not just two halves of an organ, they actually form a complete, they can't be interchanged with each other. Within the brain then, you find that there's about 12 neurotransmitters that each come in 6 pairs of 2, you know, again, and you got the same thing, you got the yin and the yang for all of these neurotransmitters. There's the agonist and the antagonist for all of these. And so most of these systems can be mirrored in some way in nature. And you see what I found interesting in my studies of working with sacred plants is that there are 2 sacred plants that actually directly correlate to one of those pairs, which is the norepinephrine or dopamine and the serotonin, which is one of those pairs. And you find that the norepinephrine or dopamine is actually relating to the mescaline, which is part of the San Pedro cactus, which happens to be a male plant. And then you got the serotonin, which relates to the DMT, which is part of the ayahuasca medicine, which is a female plant. So these 2 together mirror exactly one of those pairs of neurotransmitters that drives our neurochemistry. And so obviously the question is, first of all, when you come from a traditional side, you see, if you talk to a shaman, they say A or B, let's just call it A or B, you know, ayahuasca, San Pedro, it's a lifetime of teaching on its own. Why do you need the second one? You know, you can spend more than one lifetime just exploring ayahuasca and you would never need the other one. And you will hear the same from a Huachumero. He will tell you, San Pedro is all you need, that's all you need to do. And so the idea of an integral approach to this is relatively new, but I mean, it started with Ken Wilber, I guess, not too long ago, and now it's becoming more and more popular to actually try to understand that with a more complex society, our minds have also grown much more complex. So now obviously the solutions that were appropriate a few thousand years ago might not be fully appropriate now anymore. I always use an example from a different point of view. It's, if you look at Patanjali's 8 Limbs of Yoga, you know, when that was crafted, it was very appropriate and probably sufficient. But then with the coming of age, and you see in the 60s when Kundalini Yoga was then publicly released and other yoga types that were kept secret for a long time, it just shows that with the evolution of that, it's the acknowledgement of the fact that these old traditions have to evolve with the society they're used in. And this is exactly what happens with the plants as well. You know, for millennia, maybe 5, maybe 10,000 years, they have been used just on their own. For one reason, because the about 50 tribes in the rainforest that use ayahuasca, they never had contact with anyone else. There's still uncontacted tribes in the Amazon rainforest. So these people never had contact with anyone. The high cultures in the Andes, they had a bit of a different challenge that came with a ship from Spain, and so they were kind of like exterminated. So their tradition vanished as well and wasn't really accessible anymore because the priests that were responsible for preserving those traditions, they withdrew into the secrecy, which is also interesting because that's where the name from San Pedro comes from. Because it's obviously it's not a Maya or an Inca word, but when the Inquisition came and when the missionaries would try to convert all the savages to Christians, they basically left them no choice. But obviously they didn't like to give up their religion, so they needed to find a code word for Huachuma. And so they looked into the Bible and thought, oh, yeah, St. Peter, that's the guy who holds the keys to heaven. That's, of course, San Pedro. And everyone who has done San Pedro knows that is exactly what it is. It's St. Peter. So, and this also again shows this is a universal energy. You know, that the Christian Bible comes from a place where there's definitely nothing like San Pedro in the culture, in the history. But they have a figure to represent that energy, that consciousness. And so that consciousness is the consciousness of the San Pedro plant, which then, you know, and so you can see it whatever way you want. Or maybe the conquistadors did a bad thing, maybe they did a good thing, you know, who knows. It all has its purpose, you know, and that certainly served its purpose there. But the point is then, with the retraction of the priests into the underground, it was even more difficult for these plants to actually get together at some point. So I would say up until 20 or 30 years ago, nobody would use them in conjunction because they would simply never have met and they would never cross anyone's mind. When I say use in conjunction, it's very important to understand that it doesn't mean taking them together, because that actually is dangerous. anyone who knows how ayahuasca works chemically knows that it's a very, very, very bad idea to take anything else with it, especially stuff that increases your blood pressure, and what mescaline does. So you can actually kill yourself with that. So when often people ask me, why do ayahuasca and San Pedro together, it's often a misunderstanding of that. The day and the night also don't come together. They come sequentially. So the idea of doing ayahuasca and San Pedro also is sequentially. Every of these rituals has a place in the time of the day. I know that some people do ayahuasca during the day, some people do San Pedro at night. There's nothing wrong in principle with that. It's just understanding that you're either weakening or strengthening the energy of the plant. Because if you use a plant that is a female plant at the night time, you will exacerbate that female energy, that night energy. If you use it during the day, you will actually weaken it, and that can have a purpose too. There's no right or wrong with most of things. Apart from, like I said, the fact that you shouldn't take ayahuasca and San Pedro together at the same time. That might not work so well. But apart from that, there are no rules. And it's just to understand what is the purpose and what is the intention of the work you're doing in order to understand what you want to use it and how you want to use it. Because also, because the San Pedro is much less visual, it doesn't have to be taken at night where there's less distraction from the light. But taking ayahuasca when there's distraction from the light, that might actually work against your inner work. It might be more distraction. San Pedro is also more, and this is where we're actually now sliding into the topic, the yin and the yang. Now, how do they relate with each other? And so the ayahuasca, which is the introspective, reflective work, which is the quiet, the communicative, the flowy rather than the structured work, is obviously done in that context. Whereas the San Pedro is more male, is more directed, is more structured, and is more outward directed. I also find that while on ayahuasca you almost leave the physical plane and work a lot astrally and work on the astral plane, on San Pedro you're very much grounded into the body and into your environment. So these are complementaries. And I find the power of using them together comes multifold. One, if you only ever do one of them, so if you do an ayahuasca dieta, 3 months in the rainforest, do like 3 ceremonies a week, I've seen a lot of people come back from the rainforest with a heavy imbalance on whatever medicine they didn't use. So if you just use ayahuasca for a long time, of course, if you have an imbalance on that side, you will rebalance, but at some point you will get out of balance again. It's also important to understand the concept of balance, and also maybe that's different in an indigenous culture than in here. But your strength comes out of your center, not out of the periphery. But our society seems to be set on getting you into the periphery. It needs to be the best, the most intense, the fastest. It's always about superlatives. It always has to be the most extreme. But that drives you into the periphery, which makes you weak. Which conspiracy theorists could say is intended, because out of that, grows the need to use other things to bring you back into balance. That could be retail therapy, or substance abuse, or everything that drives the economy, basically. A happy and a healthy person doesn't buy stuff. So why would a capitalist economy want happy and healthy people? That doesn't really work. So if you create a marketing engine that drives you into the periphery, you've won already. You've brought people out of their center, and this is the opposite of what people do in the East when they meditate. They bring themselves into their center. There's no advertisements running on Times Square. This is like that's it. They go into their center. We are brought to the periphery. And while in indigenous cultures people might be much more balanced anyway, and also I don't think they quite do as intense work unless you're a shaman. But so if people do come from the West and have this imbalance challenge, this periphery challenge already, and then they do work intensively with a yin or with a yang plant for an extended amount of time, you usually end up with an even stronger imbalance. And it goes so far. I was just in Los Angeles with a fellow practitioner, and he told me that he had to use adrenaline, testosterone injections in order to balance himself back because of his heavy use of ayahuasca. He's been an ayahuasca facilitator for 7 years now, and because he's doing so many ceremonies, and he doesn't do San Pedro, his physical body got so much out of balance that he needed testosterone. That's a hormone. That's kind of the worst intervention you can do with your body. Taking hormones in any form is really the last resort. ladies. Really not a good thing. Or gentlemen as well. It's not a good thing. There's other ways, I'm sure. So the moral of the story is just to understand that everything needs to be balanced. And I find that if people do traditional ayahuasca retreats, you end up doing like 3 to 5 ceremonies in a space of 10 days because you need the time in between to rebalance yourself and then some integration afterwards. Same if you do an intensive Wachuma dieta. You wouldn't drink Wachuma every day, probably not even every second day, right? So you need the time in between to recover and go back into your balance. So now, having those tools, there is no need for that because you can use those to actually do the balancing for you. And I mean, it's not just that, obviously they do much more than that, but it's a very positive side effect of using these together, in sequence together, that you do the ayahuasca at night, next morning San Pedro, next night ayahuasca, next morning San Pedro, and you can do this for X number of days. I've personally gone up to 10, so that means 20 ceremonies in a row in 10 days. So most people do 20 ceremonies in a year, right? So, but it works. It works very well and it actually works better. You find that the people who don't use the San Pedro, they need more time to reach the same level of integration that the people who use the plants consecutively, because of the energy with these, how they work, they say that ayahuasca shows you what you need to work on, while San Pedro shows you how to do it. Of course, these rules come with exceptions. A lot of people get insights what to do on San Pedro and how to do it on ayahuasca. It's not a law, it's a rule, right? And so I find this very helpful. So the oscillation between those two brings you into what you need to do, and then the action, how to do it, and out of the action often arises the next question, but how do I do this? And then you go back to ayahuasca to find out how to do it, and then San Pedro shows you what you need to do it. And so this works pretty well together. And a lot of people have concerns about, isn't that too exhausting, or isn't that a lot of strain on mind, body, whatever. One of the retreats I like to talk about often is we went to Yelapa, Mexico with a group from Cape Cod, from the East Coast here. All lovely yoginis, most of them ladies, there were a few men. They were all between 65 and 78. 3 of them gave this retreat to themselves for their 70th birthday. They all did 9 ceremonies in 5 days, 5 ayahuascas, 4 San Pedros, and an Iboga at the end. So if anyone here is less than 78, I'm sure you can do that too. It definitely works. And it's actually less exhausting than it sounds. It is more exhausting not to do the other. If you do a 5-day retreat with 5 San Pedros, no ayahuasca, or a 5-day retreat with 5 ayahuascas, no San Pedro, you will not be as fit as those ladies were after the 10 ceremonies, trust me. So like I said, we looked at the first two. This is kind of easy because we can relate to concepts like that. We can relate to the concept of masculine and feminine. We can relate to concept of day and night, left and right. Many people know about the brain and the concepts that come with it. And yin and yang is just one name for it that's actually quite fitting, because that takes us to the next level. Because while on the exoteric we can relate to things, and it's duality, right? We know that things are dual from a physical experience of it. So, but now if you look at the yin and yang, you get the black and the white with the dots in it, but then there's a little line around it as well. So the yin and the yang is not just the yin and the yang, it's actually 3 things. If you count the black and the white, then the one on the outside, that is the non-dual. And this is where it brings us from the lighter esoteric topics of yin and yang to the more in-depth one, where I go into the Vedas and where I go into the Kabbalah. Because if you understand that the kabbalistic tree of life has more than 2 elements, it actually has quite a number of more, but the 3 main elements are the blueprint and the template for all the other ones. They're called sphera. They're little spheres. And so the top sphera is Kita. It's the crown, which obviously relates to our crown chakra as well, and is the Ein Sof. It's the unlimited potentiality that is nothing and everything, and contains the potentiality for everything in it while being nothing. So the problem with that is that we cannot comprehend something to be neither yin nor yang, but both at the same time as well. So this is where the experience gets difficult. So this is why when you do ayahuasca or San Pedro, the experience is quite integratable still, because you're relating to female issues or male issues, or masculine or feminine, sorry, not necessarily male or female. And so these things, they also relate to archetypes. So working with the archetype of the masculine and the feminine, you relate to the archetype of the mother, ayahuasca is called the mother or the father. San Pedro is the father, or peyote is another form of it. And so these archetypes represent much more than just a mother. And of course, I'm not talking about your mother, because some people say, oh my God, I don't want to spend a night with my mother. She was a terrible person, She didn't love me, she was abusive. It's not your mother, it is everyone's mother's mother. That is ayahuasca. It's the archetypical mother, what a mother's energy stands for. And so the relationship of you to your mother, the archetypical mother, is your relationship to having the right to live, to being alive. Because the mother, Gaia, this planet, is what gives birth to life. So without mother, you have no right to live. And this is where often problems come from. The lack of mother's love then leads to often drug addictions and stuff like that, where I find that the work with ayahuasca sometimes fixes that in just one ceremony, making you understand that there was never a moment when you did not have your mother. She was always there, even while your physical mother might not have been, but your mother, she was always with you, and realizing that in a ceremony is very powerful. So mother's love is unconditional. You can assault and kill someone, and your mom will say, he's still my son. She'll love you anyway. So the father is a different energy. The father is more remote. That child shares the aura with the mother for the first 7 years, not just the first 9 months in utero, but afterwards as well. 7 years you share your aura with the mother, which means you're basically almost one person still. So that means for the father, obviously they were involved 9 months prior to the birth for a little bit, and then the next 9 months it's kind of like a bit remote, It's like there's a bit of a relationship, and depending on your spiritual practice, you can of course interact energetically, with a child, but it's not quite the same. And then even when it's out, at first it needs the mother, it needs the milk, it needs all of those things that you can obviously have a bottle of pumped breast milk and stuff, but it is still, you're just like a surrogate mother, literally at that point. The role of the father starts only after those 7 years. So the father's role in that relationship is much more remote, to the extent that it's almost a one-way thing for a long time for a child. So the archetypical father also represents authority, because it's not unconditional. When you come home with bad grades, your father's not going to love you, So of course I'm drawing the black and white picture of it. I'm not saying your father has been like that, but the archetypical father is more the representation of our archetype for God than of that for life. So because it's a more one way, it's more conditional, we can pray to God for something, but if that happens, if we get the key to the car, is the next question, so we can ask for it. And so this is the relationship to the father, and so the father represents authority. So when then you work with these two plants, the mother and the father, you will work through those kinds of issues, if there's issues with the self-love, self-worth, ayahuasca, fantastic, because it's the mother's love, it's the being loved, not being rejected. Then issues with authority, if you're still, even though you should have left the rebellious phase 20 years behind, you're still rebelling, the father's going to be a good medicine for you, because it's going to teach you that it's good to question things, but rebellion just for rebellion's sake is not doing yourself a favor. And so understanding this is something that I find the San Pedro works very well with. So this also brings to the next point. The medicine you should be working with is the one that you struggle the most. The medicine is just nice and lovely, it's good, and it's nice to have a nice experience, and sometimes that's what you need. But the challenging medicine ceremonies are the ones where you learn, the ones where you are faced with the things you need to work on. So, and often people do it the other way around, of course. We live in a society where we have an extreme aversion to discomfort. Did you know that the United States consumes 75% of all the opiates produced in the world, synthetic and natural? So it's not like Afghanistan or something. That's where they're grown and brought here. 75% of all painkillers, opiates, are consumed by 300 million Americans. Not everyone, but statistically a lot. And why is that? They don't like pain. Rather than having pain, they take a pill. The next thing is antidepressants. I mean, I don't know the exact numbers there, but I think America's pretty far on the forefront there as well. So people avoid discomfort, pain, and so what do they buy for it? Antidepressants don't make you undepressed. I don't even know why they're called antidepressants, because they just make you zombied out. They should be called zombie pills, because they put you, they coat you with a layer of that you don't feel anything. And obviously, if you look into the purpose of Western medicine, you understand it's not about healing you, it's about making you able to work. You know, if somebody's too depressed, they're not going to work. If they're too happy, they're not going to work. So if you keep them somewhere in the middle, they're going to work. So that works. I mean, just ask yourself the question, do you know anything that you can buy in a pharmacy that actually cures something? Insulin? Not really. You have to keep taking it. Antidepressants, you have to keep taking them. You name whatever thing you can buy in the pharmacy, you have to take it while you have it. Aspirin makes you not feel the pain. The pain is actually not gone. If you look on the aspirin, they tell you if the pain persists for more than 5 days, stop taking the aspirin because you might have something worse. So the aspirin just interrupts the transmission of the pain in the nerves. So that's actually dangerous, because if you have something more severe, like a swelling of the brain, and you mask that, you might die by taking. I mean, you know how many people die from aspirin every year? A lot. And so, but the purpose is, of course, do you know that the American corporation law makes the responsibility of the CEO is only to the shareholder value? So if I make a product that makes customers buy my products, I'm impacting shareholder value very badly. So if I, as a CEO of a pharmaceutical company, create a cure for something, the shareholders have the legal right to sue me for it. It's a bit of a conflict of interest, I would say. So maybe that's something to think about. But of course, you know, the idea is not to, because if you can sell people insulin, why would you sell them something that cures them of needing the insulin? Because you can sell them the insulin at an upmarket. That doesn't make any sense to develop something, because, believe it or not, ayahuasca cures diabetes. I've not worked with a single person yet with diabetes that didn't get rid of the diabetes with the ayahuasca. And actually there's studies on that show how it works, and it was actually in 1986, it was patented in the United States as a medication for diabetes. So, but obviously, like I said, there's no shareholder value in selling a cure for a pharmaceutical company. So, where was I? So the medicines you should be working with, you know, it's obviously the ones where you feel most challenged, you know, and people avoid, like I said, the discomfort, the pain, but you know how organisms learn through two things. They seek pleasure and they avoid pain. That's how an organism learns and evolves. If you cut off half of that by avoiding pain, you can't learn, you know. Of course, we all seek pleasure all the time, you know. That seems to be out of balance, because for the amount we avoid discomfort, we're now seeking pleasure instead. But the people that have children, or are, you know, uncles or aunts, or know people with children, know the one thing: it doesn't matter how often you tell the child not to touch the candle, until they burn themselves, they'll touch the candle. So that shows us that pain is a much greater teacher than pleasure. Because you can reward them and say, you're not touching the candle, here's another, whatever, an apple or something as a reward. But they will touch the candle until they burn themselves. No reward can save them from that. That shows that the greater teacher, and you all know this, you learn from mistakes much more than from doing something correct. You know, if you make a mistake, you will remember that for a long time, and you will not do that ever again. That's not the same thing if you do something right, and something rewards you. Yeah, that kind of works, but it doesn't stay so long. So avoiding pain means that we actually stunt our own evolution and growth substantially, because we don't have that feedback. We don't have the big amount of feedback from the pain. And going into an ayahuasca ceremony or even meditation, you don't have to take something if you don't want to. You know, the idea of doing a ceremony is just, it's an easier method of delivering that altered state. You can reach an altered state of consciousness in 100 million ways. Like there's 100 million different types of meditation, there's 100 million ways to alter your consciousness. The reason I use ayahuasca is I find, or plant medicines in general, I use more than just ayahuasca, is that it's a paradigm that works for people. We are born into this dualistic worldview where we believe that things are made out of material, atoms, the Greeks called it, you know. So we believe that things needs to be physical. So if you just tell people, I'm going to do shamanic drumming, or I'm going to do some Reiki on you, it works on a lot of people. I'm not dissing that. It's great. All of this stuff works. But if you're not ready for it, you doubt it. And then the placebo effect, which accounts for 15% in each direction, works for or against you. So if you don't believe in something, it's 15% less effective. And if you believe in something, it's 15 more. That's 30% difference. That's a lot. Because if I give you a medicine and you consider myself to be the physician, then you're following the paradigm that you've had since you were born. When you were ill, your mom would take you to the doctor would prescribe something, you would take it, and a week later you'd be healed. What obviously is happening is that not the medicine heals you, it's the conscious attention your parents give you while you're ill. Your parents look after you, they give you more affection, and that's what heals you. It's not some medicine, that is a false belief as well. But it's a paradigm we believe. So if I give you a medicine, you believe that this is happening again. In Germany, we have a saying, a flu takes with medication a week and without 7 days. And we probably all know that's exactly how it is. There's nothing you can take to make your flu go away quicker. You can make yourself work in those 7 days with medication, and that's obviously why there's all of these things that suppress the cough and that suppress the temperature, but that's the worst you can do. If your body makes or if your body's sick, that's your body talking to you and saying, maybe you need a timeout and not go to work every day. Maybe you've done too much, or you've done too much on other levels, but you need rest. If you are ill, you need rest. You don't need medication. Anyway, so but that obviously doesn't work, because if everyone's you go out on a Thursday, which means on Friday you feel bad, so you don't go to work. So you can't do this every week. That's 3 days a week off instead of 2. That's too much. So the whole concept of the medicine works. And I'm not saying that physicians in generally are not healers and they can't heal. They are. Of course they are healers. That's why they became physicians. And I'm not doubting the good intentions. It's just that the Cartesian worldview kind of works against them. The Cartesian worldview makes a distinction between spirit and matter, and the spirit and matter distinction draws us away from where the actual disease is. The disease is not in the body, the disease is in the subtle bodies. And if you look at the disease, you see the symptoms. That's all you can see. If you come from a Cartesian point of view, you see, okay, there's a rise in temperature, there's an increased amount of white blood cells, but the symptoms are merely is the effect of some cause that is invisible because it's in the subtle bodies. I use the example of the Titanic to illustrate that. If the iceberg would have been the symptom, the Titanic wouldn't have sunk. But there's so much more to the disease than the symptoms, and this is what you can't treat if you can't see them. But you cannot even measure them. This is why when you go to a doctor, they have apparatus for like $1 million, $2 million, and they do CAT scans, and they can see every cell in your body in real time. That can't tell you what's wrong with you, unless it's like something physically wrong. But the doctor speaks to you in order to understand what your condition is. And it's not just what you say, it's also the non-verbal messages that the doctor gets that helps him to understand. Because from seeing hundreds of people every week, you know that a person who has a certain energy has a certain disease. And so that way they can deduct it. So there are healers, of course. It's just that the tool and the framework, the tool set and the framework they're using is basically just blindfolding them and binding both hands on their back, and then you diagnose the patient, because they're not taking into account the other 90% of the patient, and the other 90% of the patient, they're kind of getting an idea while they're talking to them, but the tools they have, the millions of dollars gear, that can't see that bit. That only sees the 10% or 5%, or it might be 1%. Who knows what the ratios is. There was often the talk about the conscious and the subconscious mind, where Freud was saying, well, it's like the iceberg, 10%, 90%, but I think nowadays we have more in agreement that the conscious mind is more like a snowball in comparison to the Antarctic. It's actually just a very, very tiny amount that we're physically and consciously aware of. So the duality, and like I said, the duality works for us in this instance when we satisfy people's paradigm. We satisfy people's desire for being confirmed in this, what they live in, the duality, that I am not you, we're separate, I'm separate from this table, and of course, even though I'm wearing those clothes, they're still separate from me because I can take them off, So all of that is easy. When you now come into a non-dual state, and the non-dual state, again, it's a bit of a trap, because you can obviously say, yeah, no, I understand, we're all one, no question, easy. Well, it's not quite that easy, because it's the same as Buddhism. Understanding that everything's impermanent and everything's empty, you understand that mentally in a split second. But it takes lifetimes to actually make wisdom out of that knowledge. And it's the same with that. Once you understand we're all one, but we're not. Because I just look at you and you're not me. So we're not one, but we are. And this is exactly where it lies. And this is where psychedelics and the expanded states of consciousness help us to reconcile polar opposites. Because how can you be one with everyone and separate from everyone. You can't be separate and one, but you can. And this is exactly what happens on different levels. And only when you understand and embrace that, rather than just saying, everything's one, we're all one. Of course, but that's not the whole truth. And we're separate is also not the whole truth. And so leaving that paradigm, though, is like a very, very unusual experience, because then we come into the realm of the non-dual, which is mentally, we can conceptualize it, but experiencing that is a different thing. And so for those of you who have done Iboga, that's the closest you can get to a non-dual state. Right? Whereas on Ayahuasca, you can, of course, experience leaving your body, but you will always have the concept of the polarity of things. It takes a lot to come out of that on Ayahuasca or San Pedro, right? Because they are essentially yin and yang. They are not pure enough in both. And so if you look at the Iboga experience, that actually takes you into that, and now we'll go back to the tree of life, into the top sphere, which is the one that is the unlimited potential. This is the universe, the ocean in a drop, right? Which is, and everything's in there. And out of this duality, it splits by saying, okay, out of this dual everything, I am everything, everything is me, goes the I, which is the first sphere, the one's zero, then we got the first sphere, and then the second is the you. So the I and the you are the important ones because we understand them. These are almost back to the exoteric ones. The I and the you is the Ayahuasca and San Pedro. That depends on your polarity, not on your gender, on your polarity. If the Ayahuasca is the I, or if the San Pedro is the I and the other one's the you. It's your polarity internally what you're working with. And so these three together form the top three sphere of the tree of life, and so the other ones are just made by the blueprint of those three. So the top three, after the top three, there's actually what they call the abyss, which is the demarcation between the top three, which are unique on their own. It's almost like prime numbers. And then the next one that follows are basically made out of those. You just flip the top three, and then you move them down again, and then you have the tree of life out of the first three, which the first one springs the other two. So this is the three substances together, or the three plants, the three energies, the three consciousnesses that we work with. So integrating those is quite interesting. And the number three appears, or seems to appear, in virtually every philosophical, mystical, religious, or spiritual tradition. It's not just the Trinity the Christians have, although there are about 3 or 4 non-Trinitarian Christian sects, which is quite interesting, but everyone else does it. You got the same in the Vedas, you get the Trinity there, and you got the triple gem for the Buddhists, You basically can look at everything and you see those three seem to be appearing everywhere. And what is interesting is that in the alchemical world, you got the same concept again. The alchemical doesn't go into the two halves, into the yin and yang, but it goes into the Trinity. So in order to make an alchemical, and that's something that has been gaining momentum lately very much, is microdosing. Most people microdose by just taking the entheogen of their choice and putting it in a lot of water. Which is nothing wrong with that. Again, it's just one way of microdosing, but it's kind of like a very unrefined, not very elegant way of doing it, because you're not capturing the whole plant. From an alchemical point of view, every plant is made out of 3 parts. It's the body, the mind, and the spirit of the plant. These 3 parts cannot be taken out by one process. The spirit of the plant is usually essential oils, volatile substances, oily substances, these things which evaporate. If you cook something, they evaporate. Anyone who's ever had like a piece of ayahuasca and smelled that before you cook it has almost like a minty, camphory smell. It's a beautiful, beautiful essences. If you smell a cooked ayahuasca, you won't smell that anymore. Not just because it smells vile, it's because that stuff's gone. It's gone. It's not in there anymore. So in order to preserve the spirit of the plant, you need to extract in a certain way that can be done with aqueous distillation or ethanolic extraction, the volatile part, which is also the head note. You could say if you're in a perfume, you've got 3 parts as well. That's the head note of the perfume as well. So the next one is the one that usually every tincture virtually that exists comprised of is the mind of the plant. That's the watery extract. If I cook something, if I make an alcoholic extract of something, I get the mind of the plant. Nothing else. I don't get sometimes I catch a little bit of the spirit, but never the body. Which is why if you make a cannabis tincture or a tincture of something, it actually is not a cannabis or marijuana tincture anymore afterwards. It's a THC tincture because it's the tincture has now recollection anymore of the plant it was once. It has the ingredients, but it's lost the body. The body is like the DNA of the plant. And that is locked into the matter of the plant that it cannot be extracted easily. The only way to do it virtually is, and it's a staged process, you extract the head node first, the spirit, then you extract the body. And what's left over after you've done a thorough extraction of the other two, you have to incinerate the plant matter into a white ash. It doesn't have to be, it has to be white ash. That white ash then contains the precise ratio of minerals that makes that plant. It's almost like the crystal. You know, a crystal has the energetic structure. Our bones are crystals. You know, they're made out of minerals, and because of their length, they're vibrational crystals. You know, they're like antennas. And so the same way in the plant, through the whole plant, has these minerals locked into the fiber of the plant. If you don't transport these into the essence is just a chemical. It's not a plant essence anymore. So what you do is, once you have that white ash, you wash it out with water in order to generate an alkaline solution of the ash, basically. And you recombine that. You recombine all three phases back into one, which is then called the plant stone, out of the alchemical process. And the plant stone is the basis of which the alchemical spagyric essences are made. Of course, it doesn't work for LSD because there's no plant that grows. I mean, of course, there is a plant. We have to stand corrected. There are plants that don't just do LSA, they actually do LSD. For a long time it was thought it's fully synthetic. It isn't. There are plants that produce it, but small amounts. And it's not the full, you get other salt alkaloids in there. So that's always a danger as well. A lot of the naturally occurring LS, like LSA, the baby wood rose, they have a lot of cyanides in there, which makes them very toxic to consume on their own. But you can't obviously make out of a chemical. So you couldn't make a spagyric MDMA, right? You could make a spagyric sassafras maybe, but a spagyric MDMA wouldn't work. So from plants you can make it. What are the advantages of a spagyric is the next question. Why don't you just take the plant, the full plant, or do a homeopathic, or like a watery? So while the water carries the vibration if you just dilute a plant or a substance, or it also carries the vibration if you make a homeopathic, it doesn't quite have the strength. And that might also have to do with my background. As I said, I'm a chemist. From my scientific point of view, if you have a D1 or D2 homeopathic dilution, which means less than 1 molecule per liter, I don't know. Are you buying water? Technically you are. What I found interesting, though, and it's not that I don't believe in homeopathy. My ex-wife, we were vegan, raw vegan, and she had something where she had to take salmon D5 or D6. Her breath smelled of salmon. So how is that possible for somebody who doesn't eat fish or anything, and you take something which doesn't contain any salmon chemically at all, nothing. But the energy of the salmon is so strong in there that it invokes the energy of the salmon in the person. So I had to say that was what convinced me. I don't know how about you guys, but for me that was like, I don't take homeopathic medicine myself, but at least I don't question it anymore, and I don't smile at people who do, because it has to work. If it does that, it has to work. I'm a scientist, so it does work. But for me, what I like about the spagyrics is that they're not quite as subtle. The idea also is, like I said, that's then the comparison downward to the high dilution, because obviously you can do a high dilution, you wouldn't run into any issues because you're selling water. It's legal to sell water in most countries in the world, so you can have a homeopathic whatever, and it's legal because it is technically water by law. The full plant, of course, you run into various issues, starting legal as well, but also then doing a ceremony, there's a lot of things to take into account, and it's not just babysitter, dog sitter, diet, need to take a day off, need to take all my stuff to some place, and often travel abroad. Most people do ceremonies abroad. So that comes with a whole lot of things around. And the diet, some people don't understand. The diet is not just food. There's also sexual abstinence and all of these things, which some people struggle with to understand why you have to do it and all of that. So it's not the most convenient thing to do once a week, because if you have to do 3 days prior and 3 days after, that leaves you 1 day a week where you can actually do something. So not a good thing, So that doesn't work for everyone. Some people, if you're a monk, maybe that's okay, depending on what type. But if you want to live a life as a householder, which we all are, everyone here is a householder, including myself, of course. That's our incarnation this time. Nobody's meant to be a monk here, and so doing these ceremonies has its side effects. It's good to do them, and it's good to do them in retreat style, compressed, a few together, and then have a few weeks or months integration in between. What I like is with the spagyric essences, you can actually bridge the time in between and keep the practice. Because the spagyrics don't interact with any medication. That's another downside of taking ayahuasca is if you're on something chemical or made out of crude oil, you're very likely not to be compatible with an ayahuasca ceremony. Why? Because where ayahuasca comes from, the people there weren't stupid enough to make oil into plastic and pills and take them. So it's literally, ayahuasca is the most non-toxic substance in the world. It is virtually impossible to drink that much that you could harm yourself with it, unless you're on pharmaceuticals. That is the big thing. So then I would personally say it's more the pharmaceutical that kills you than the ayahuasca, because the ayahuasca doesn't. The pharmaceuticals do. If you take enough of antidepressants in one go, you're dead too. Ayahuasca doesn't happen. So that's another point to take into account. So, some people can't or don't want to go off their medication, and I also say they shouldn't, right? The worst thing to do is wean yourself off your medication prior to a ceremony, because then you might run into the risk of getting anxiety attacks, and then you groove in those neurotransmitter pathways even more. So that's something to avoid. So with the spagyric essences, you don't have to do any diet, you don't have to do any preparation. If you look at it from a yoga perspective, maybe you would have your daily yoga. You go to yoga in the morning before work or after work or in the lunch break, depending how your day is planned out. So you can do your, let's say 5 times a week. Doesn't have to be daily, but 5 times a week you do your yoga to keep up the practice. But that's obviously not the same as doing a retreat over a weekend or a week where you do yoga 3 times a day and don't have to go to work in between. I see it's the same interaction between the essences and a ceremony. It's not meant to replace a ceremony. It's not even meant to be doing the same thing. It's a completely different thing. It's the daily practice. It's the daily maintenance, so to speak. Another advantage is, your greatest strength is always your greatest weakness. We have this incredible mind. We have which is probably the most complex piece of engineering in the known universe. It is capable of creating pieces of metal that fly humans through outer space. It can write novels, and it can make art, the most incredible things it's capable of. But at the same time, it's also your greatest demise. Everyone who's sick in our society has a mental problem in the first place. There are not so much physical issues anymore that we have. That's more in tribal societies where there's a more immediate relationship to your environment. Here, not so much. You're more worried about losing your job, losing your girlfriend, losing your car, getting a ticket, or whatever. These are the things you worry about. If you live in the rainforest, you're more worried about getting an infection, stepping into something, dying, literally. Here, okay, New York winter is harsh, but it's not easy to die even as a homeless person here. I'm not saying that they don't, but it's not that easy. In a tribal society, it's easy. It's easy to die, It's actually, you can be the head of the tribe, and you might just step into a spider or be bitten by something and you'll die, So it's completely different. So our problems are very much mental, and our mind creates most of our diseases, psychosomatic. You have to understand that our mind is so convincingly powerful in its imagination. We have no way of understanding or verifying any sensory input we have. If I touch something, my mind tells me there's a table, but my brain has no way of seeing that, because it's all electric signals that go into the brain. That's all it is. So our mind creates this, it's almost like a 3-dimensional holographic view of our environment, which we believe is what we see. But in scientific tests, they found out that you only use about less than 100 dots to create the whole view of your surroundings, because most of the objects are generated out of memory. They're not actually seen. And so this is the image that we see is actually not what we see, it's generated. So this is an interesting take on what a reality is as well. But the thing is, it's so real that when there's a situation you need to escape and you're attacked, what will happen is that you come into fight or flight. You use the last 10% of your reserves to save your life, which is a good thing, There's a huge bureaucracy. Sorry. That's okay. So that is the fight or flight. It's like a survival instinct, and which is important. But if you are, who's ever seen somebody who had a nightmare? They wake up drenched in sweat, 180 beats per minute, the heartbeat. but they're safe and sound in their own home. Nothing's actually threatening them, but they're going through the same physical symptoms than somebody whose life is threatened. And so that is the problem. If you have trauma that is stored in your mind, that your mind replays, you will be subjected to the same physical reaction every time, all the time. And that is something that you cannot physically survive. Our bodies aren't meant to do that. Your body's not meant to fight for its life once a week. That's not what it's meant to be doing. So this is where the problems are. So the mind is very powerful and very convincing. So one of the purposes of the medicine is to work out these traumas. The other thing is also that your mind is an entity of its own. Of course, it will tell you that you are the ego and the ego is you. That's the Highlander thing. There can only be one, and that's obviously your ego. Nothing else exists. And so the ego will try to tell you that it's only that you are the ego. But it is not the case. So if you do anything to challenge the sovereignty, of the ego, it will defend itself. And so this is exactly what happens when you do sacred plant work. And in a lesser extent also with meditation and other techniques, because you go and look into it and let things unfold, but definitely if you do very deep expanded consciousness work. So what the ego will do, it will defend itself. It will say, I don't believe that, that's humbug, you're just hallucinating, why would you quit your job on a whim? All of these things is what your ego will say, Or leave your spouse on a whim, So this is what your ego will say. This is what your mind will try to put against. And so there's two stages in the ceremony where the ego will interfere. It's in the actual experience. It will, and you probably all know this. You see a vision and your ego will go like, what does that even mean? A unicorn with dots, And so it's like, and so that moment you're completely out of the vision, and that's the purpose of the ego. It's trying to get you out of that space so that you're back in the mind, back in this reality. The mind is the physicality. So you avoid that because microdosing gives you no conscious effect. You don't feel anything. While you microdose, your ego it's like guerrilla tactics, Your ego doesn't even know that the enemy is already past and so it's all good. The ego doesn't know what's going on. And so I've seen, and so the microdosing is not just maintenance. I recommend it to people who are, for whatever reasons, valid reasons, if somebody doesn't want to do a ceremony, it's okay, right? There's nothing wrong with that, Of course, it's not good, but it's their journey. So, so what I recommend is giving them the microdosing, because the microdosing is so diluted. You take 3 drops out of a bottle where a whole bottle constitutes less than a portion. So you can drink the whole bottle and you wouldn't experience anything. That's how diluted they are, but they are so strong out of the dilution, out of the spagyric dilution, that you take 3 drops and they have the most amazing and profound healing effects. People that sometimes you can't tell them exactly what it is. Some people are a bit like they Google ayahuasca and that's it. They won't take it. But if you say, well, it's a tonic from the Amazon rainforest, you're not lying, right? It's the truth. That's exactly what it is, And they take it and they have the most profound transformation, healing happening. Sometimes it's intense for them. Sometimes people even say that they have intense dreams and intense transformation happening. But I've seen healing on a scale that is mind-boggling, a really, really astonishing healing coming from those microdosing. And my way of understanding that is, like I said, the ego cannot work against your experience because there is no experience. You take the microdosing, you go about your things. You can obviously take the microdosing as well, meditate and work with these energies if you're very open to it. But most people, they don't feel anything, but the shifts happen. And this is exactly what you want. And so I find in this energy field between doing the ceremony with a direct attack on the ego and like the guerrilla infiltration attack, you have a pretty good stance against it. This is also one of the reasons, by the way, why it's good to use 2 medicines. I've seen people who worked for years and a lot of ayahuasca ceremonies. The problem with with these spiritual practices, often you think like, well, after I'm doing the work, I do an ayahuasca ceremony every week, or I do a retreat every month. But the problem is, once your ego has understood how to work with that specific energy, it will find a quiet spot away from the torrent of the ayahuasca, and it will stay nice and dry in a corner where it is not affected by the ayahuasca. So that's a double whammy, because nothing's happening, but you think you're doing the work. And so then other people will notice that you stopped growing You wouldn't notice, of course. It's very difficult to see things on yourself. So you think, I'm doing all this work and this amazing, self-development, but nothing's happening. So that's a double whammy. So this is where the other side comes in. Ayahuasca was just an example. It doesn't matter which one it is, as long as you use both. So for those who understand the challenge in resistance training, weight training, and it's with every sort of exercise, you need to keep the element of surprise in order to avoid a plateau from happening. If you use the same exercise for the same muscles, with the same amount of repetitions, the same weight, you will stay there forever. So what you can do is you can do high weight low reps or low weight high reps, or you can just combine eccentric and concentric movement, or you can just vary things to just keep surprising, not the body. That's not the body that needs surprising, it's the mind. Because your body is a projection of the mind, right? So your body projects the mind, and so the body doesn't need any surprise. The mind needs the surprise, because the mind gets used to the way of the exercise, the weight and the movement, and it will be able within a few days to use that weight in the most effective way, with the least efficient, basically, so you won't grow anymore, because the body knows how to conserve energy. That's all about conserving energy. And so if you use the element of surprise, it works. And it's the same for the mental work with the ayahuasca. You need the element of surprise in order to make sure that it doesn't find the couch potato spot, and it doesn't stop doing the work. And so this is why you use these two together in this context. And so they two together form the atom of the program. And then you just have repeating steps of those. The third one then, as I was saying, is a bit, and it's probably the one that the least here have actual experience in, because it is quite an interesting one. It doesn't come from South America, first of all. I mean, there's an analog of Iboga in South America too, but what you will see is that where the plants come from, the continents, they shape their character, and they shape the way they are. You see ayahuasca is very flowy and very lush and green. It comes from the rainforest. San Pedro, much more lush than peyote, for instance, which comes from the arid half desert. Same difference, same thing. If you compare a Syrian rue with ayahuasca, chemically very, very similar, but very different experience, because it is not the same plant, of course. And it goes even if you have experience with the psilocybin mushrooms, the various different mushrooms, very, very different characters. It's not just mushrooms, there are so many different characters that they display. And I mean, probably most people know it's the same goes for marijuana, not just sativa and indica, all the sub breeds are very, very different. And so you would expect the same from that. And so the analog of the Iboga is the Sananga in South America. And everyone who's done a Sananga diet or is using Sananga eye drops or something, it's got the ibogaine in, and there's no ibogaine, but it doesn't matter how much you take of Sananga, you would never have an Iboga-like experience with it, interestingly, even though chemically it should be, but it's not, which again just shows, me, the chemist, that it's not about the molecules that are in, if people talk about DMT and harmaline and mescaline, that's not the plant. That's also not what makes the experience. I actually am very sure of that. Another anecdote is what often happens is they've done studies on trying to understand how quickly harmaline goes into the bloodstream. If you take pure harmaline as a capsule, it's about an hour. So now, I don't know if you guys, people who do ceremonies, I know it's most people actually are in way faster than an hour. Way faster. So 15 minutes, sometimes 30. But I've seen people, and this is where my medical background is also baffled, I've seen people, they haven't been able to hand me the glass back before they were in. And I mean in. You could see their eyes flipping back, and they were falling backwards onto the mat. And they weren't playing. So there was and so you think hold on a second. That has barely touched their lips, let alone it's anywhere here. How can they be on something that's not in their blood at all? Nothing. How is that possible? The next thing you have to understand, your stomach is lined with a mucus so that it doesn't digest itself, but also nothing can be absorbed in the stomach. Nothing. That's the idea of the mucus. So while it's in here, you can't really begin to journey. And so you probably know if people purge, it pretty much looks like what they drank. But that means it's still in the stomach. You don't purge stuff from further down. If you're purging something and it looks like what you drank, how can you be on that stuff? If it's still in your stomach, that means you haven't absorbed it, right? Very interesting. And that kind of also explains the why people get contact highs. I mean, high is probably a bad word, but contact experiences. Why people join a circle without drinking, just angeling or just visiting, and the space starts warping. How can that be? You know, that is chemically not possible. And I mean, when I speak to colleagues of mine, you know, then they say, yeah, no, that's not possible. You know, how is it possible? And they say, well, you know, look, I know it's not possible, but the reason I see it happening means that, you know, whatever paradigm you have must be wrong. Because it is possible. If your paradigm doesn't allow this, then you need to work on the paradigm, because it's clearly possible. It's happening. You know, that's how science works. You deduct by observation. If I have examples where I can show it working, then I must think about the model again. That doesn't allow for these things. So the Iboga, going back to that, is quite interesting. Very, very, very different character than its South American cousins, also usually taken once in one's lifetime, because the experience is also very, very far away from being as gentle as ayahuasca or San Pedro. And I mean gentle, even if you have a heavy ayahuasca, that's gentle for Iboga. Iboga is a bit rough around the edges, right? It's an African plant. It starts with the ingestion. Iboga kind of tastes like ayahuasca-ish, right? So the way you ingest Iboga for a ceremony is that they have these shavings of the root bark, which you chew, you swallow your saliva, and your saliva tastes like ayahuasca. And you do that for up to 3 days. So imagine yourself being on an ayahuasca chewing gum for 3 days. Most people struggle to get a glass down. Can you imagine for 8 hours straight or 12 to swallow, to swish ayahuasca in your mouth? Probably not. So that's why they do it once in their life and not every month. You know. So the next thing is, if you're not into introspective mindfulness practices, meditation, then you probably have a higher threshold. And so this is why they often use very large amounts of the Iboga to break through that. I like to understand things. I come from a very traditional training. I trained with the Shipibo, which is one of the original tribes, original few tribes that used ayahuasca, and have a very traditional approach. All the other plants I work with, I believe that traditions are important, but also you have to understand that the tradition is actually linked to the cultural context more than to the actual necessities of the work. And that is just the case. And first of all, if you look at how traditions have evolved, compare the mestizo tradition to the indigenous tradition. Very different, you know. First of all, I think it's good to talk about what is traditional ayahuasca. So if somebody gives you a glass of ayahuasca, you're not in a traditional ceremony. That's the first thing you need to understand. Traditionally, only the shaman drinks. So it doesn't matter what the person's wearing, what language they're singing, or what color their skin is. If they give you ayahuasca, you're not in a traditional ceremony. That's the end of the story. I believe it's important to understand that, because you're all shamans. That's why you drink. So it's not that they're breaking the tradition. It's just not traditional, right? Traditionally, the shaman drinks in order to heal and analyze the patient, because in our Western medicine, the patient takes the medicine. In the shamanistic tradition, the shaman takes the medicine and heals energetically the patient. So you're not here as patients in that capacity then in the ceremony, you're there as shamans. And that has to do with the rising of the energy as well. If we talked about Kundalini Yoga being open to the West, as well as the Kabbalah being open to non-rabbis, you know, a while back, that has all to do with the fact that our vibration is high enough now to hold this shamanic energy. So we are meant to be shamans. That's why we drink. And that's why there's people who won't drink, because not everyone's meant to be a shaman. So they can be the patients, so to speak, if they come for healing. Not everyone comes for healing as well. So I also think patient is a bit of a derogatory term for somebody coming to an ayahuasca ceremony, because that almost puts them into the position of that something's wrong with them, you know? I mean, you could say that everyone has something wrong with them, but that's a bit of semantics again. But in that context, you see that the very, very indigenous tradition, no singing for the first hour, none. No instruments. Oops. The next one. No singing for the first hour, no instruments. So if you see a ceremony and somebody's using an instrument like a guitar, that's certainly not indigenous, because there's no guitars in the rainforest, trust me. That's a Spanish thing. So that's why the mestizos use guitars, because the Spanish influence. The shapaka as well, mestizo. The indigenous don't really use the shapaka. It's a very, very mestizo thing. And so you understand, so why are they doing it completely different? Well, not completely, but substantially different. Why are they doing it different? The life and the socio-cultural context in an indigenous tribal settlement is very different from a small mestizo, like a Spanish settlement. So these are different, and so the natural extrapolation of that would be, so what does it mean for people who live like this in a postmodern society, in an urban jungle, who don't live like, even in settlements? Obviously you could say the indigenous as well as the mestizo tradition, as nice as they are, but how do they relate to our socio-cultural context? Not really, So you have to understand that these things are done in a way they are done to honor that socio-cultural context, plus to honor the way the plant needs to be worked with. Because if you look at comparative philosophy or theology, you see there are the parallels I was talking about. So the things that are done, some of them are done for very good reasons, and they need to be done in some way. And not necessarily in the way they're doing it in that tradition, but they need to be honored and they need to be done. But a lot of things, I was just meeting with a fellow practitioner who does a lot here on the East Coast this afternoon. And she's a lady, and I was talking about, we were talking about how is it to work with people on antidepressants, and I said, yeah, I believe that essentially it's something a shaman should be able to work with, because what is a chemical molecule other than a number of atoms, which is energy? And so what do shamans work with? Energy. So how can they not work with a molecule made of energy? That doesn't make any sense. It has to do with a missing socio-cultural context, because they are not used to these medications. But a Western doctor, somebody with a Western medical background, should understand those energies enough to incorporate them. And then I was using the next example when they say, yeah, women in their period shouldn't be attending ceremonies either. And I said, well, this is really shit. That is not true. It's not true. That is just, and you have to again see, where does it come from? It comes from a very machismo culture in South America. There's a reason why they say it's difficult, but difficult doesn't mean it's impossible. So you have to make a distinction there. Of course, you can't just have somebody in the first 3 days of their menstrual flow in a ceremony and not do anything about it. That will disrupt the ceremony for everyone involved, of course. What happens is that there's a huge energy surge going through the body of the woman. If you don't contain that, it will radiate out onto everyone. But again, energy surge, right? So it's energy again. So the shaman should be able to work with that energy, seriously. And this is what's exactly her experience as well, and she was also coming to the same conclusion. And it's all that. It's understanding that energy that you work with, and then you can incorporate whatever the tradition says is incompatible. I don't like this impossible, incompatible. I would always ask why. And when people tell you because it's tradition, then I know that's not the answer I like. I would like to understand what is it other than serving some tradition. That's almost like serving the Bible. It's the same thing. Why do you need to serve a tradition without understanding what the things are for? And so in the same manner, traditions need to be analyzed and understood. And you don't have to sing an Ikaro out loud. You can sing the Ikaro under your breath. That doesn't make any difference. It might be less, because there's also the culture shock of some people like it if you dress up, and some people don't like it if you dress up. For some people it looks weird, and for some people it looks, he's not a shaman if he doesn't wear the headgear. But that is also, again, it's just the fixation on the external. Why does it matter what the shaman's wearing? That shouldn't make any difference. The shaman works with energy, not with his clothes. So that shouldn't make the difference as well. But again, people are at where they're at, and so this is why it's great that there's so many varying, people offering this in all kinds of ways. But I think the most important ingredient of a ceremony is the participant and the mind and the consciousness of the participant. Not some tradition, not some medicine, not some shaman, definitely not the shaman, No, the participant is the most important bit. And so you need to honor and understand and integrate what the participant brings, And calling it ayahuasca ceremonies is almost also bad, because, a car repair shop is also not called a spanner shop. They work with more than one tool. It's about fixing the car, not about the screwdriver, Making it an ayahuasca ceremony is almost like glorifying the tool, It's not about the tool. The tool is good, and it's important, and it's wonderful, but it's a tool. It is what the shaman uses or you use to do something. It's not about the tool, it's about you, And so that's what needs to be taken into account. which is why I refer to the work I do as transformation retreats or transformation ceremonies rather than ayahuasca or San Pedro or shamanism. Because then again, you pigeonhole yourself into something else again. If you go into shamanism, shamanism has nothing to do with the systems I was talking about earlier. The purpose of shamanism is they are doctors. They are the doctors of the rainforest. They're not meant to be priests. They're not meant to be giving you enlightenment. And I mean, it's also not. It doesn't take a rocket scientist. How many enlightened ascended masters and come from the Indian subcontinent or from other parts of the world? How many come from South America? I don't know. I wouldn't say there's none. That's always extreme. But why are there not more people enlightened in South America if ayahuasca enlightens people? It doesn't seem to be doing it. I mean, they've been drinking it for 5,000 years, and there's no big, person came out of South America so far. So it's not. That is a tool. If you don't use it the right way, or whatever, it's not the wrong way. If you use it to heal people's bodies, you will heal people's bodies. If you use it for exploration, for development, then that's what's going to happen. And so this is why I call my work transformation retreats rather than shamanic ayahuasca ceremonies, because it looks like there's no difference in a shamanic ayahuasca ceremony and what I do, because it looks the same on the outside, of course, but on the inside, what's happening, how I work and how I work energetically, but also the framework that I use is completely different. So that's where you would see the differences. So all three medicines I use in a different way. I've trained very, very strict, some of them for a long time in my apprenticeship, with those three plants to understand the ins and outs, the last bits about how they work, how they would like to be served, because I am serving the plants, of course. They help me, they use me to serve them. And so with that, you need to understand how they need to be worked with, but then you need to understand your own gift and what you bring into the ceremony. When you learn an instrument, when you learn guitar or piano, first of all, you will play other people. First of all, you just play like notes, but at some point you play other people's music. That's the first thing. But once you become a master, you don't play other people's music anymore. You compose your own music. And that's the same in working with sacred plants. When you learn, you serve the plants the way they have been served for thousands of years, because that's the way for you to understand how it works. But once you understand how it works, you should grow into yourself and realize that you can create a new modality out of these. And this is what every good healer should be doing, And I think a lot of healers just lack the confidence in their own abilities to step away from tradition, because as long as they have tradition, they can say, well, I did it according to tradition, so it has to be right. Rather than, it's also a risk, of course, I can do something that might not be correct, So far, luckily, that hasn't happened. So, but, nobody is perfect. But as far as I'm concerned, it's not that I came up with the idea of doing these things this way. The plants tell you how to work. I have a very, very, very special recipe for my ayahuasca. The ones who've drank with me know this. It's very unique in the world, in the way it's made and in the way it's done. I cook my medicine for 3 weeks. If you talk to people and they say, yeah, no, my shaman, he cooks a long time, he cooks for 8 hours, Yeah, I cook for 8 hours, but 3 weeks for 8 hours every day, So it's a very different medicine. I use different plants in there as well. And I have other mechanisms which are quite unique. One is that I separate the main component, the healing component, which contains the ayahuasca vine, from the DMT containing part, for several reasons. One is, of course, the plant told me, but the other one is that physiologically it makes more sense to wait until the inhibitor is in your blood before you take the DMT, because if the inhibitor is not in your blood, the DMT will be broken down. So you lose material which has a higher body footprint. And it was interesting, there was a conference in 2013 in California, and the one gentleman did his thesis, I don't know if it was a master or a PhD, on shamans' ayahuasca. He's had 400 different shamans, sent them the ayahuasca, was analyzed, and he said, interesting, he did the whole scientific thing. It was like between 200 and 400 milligrams of harmaline, how much, all of this. He said the one thing he found interesting is no shaman separates the ayahuasca vine from the DMT, which would make sense. It's chemically more stable, it's easy to dose both sides. And I was in the audience, luckily, and say, well, it's not quite correct that nobody does it, because I do it. And I found that my apprentices all do it as well. All the people that studied with me all use this very effective approach. So that's one difference. With the San Pedro, I also have a very, very special preparation that takes a lot of the disadvantages into account. San Pedro comes in a these packages that you can't open, where your fingernails break and you need a knife and then you destroy the contents trying to open the packaging. It's kind of San Pedro a little bit, It's this gloopy, snotty stuff, and you drink it, and once it's down, you think that was the worst bit, but the worst bit is about to come when it starts, because in your stomach it forms this rubber ball, and obviously your stomach acid can't get any of the substances out, because it's not even rubber, it's like snot, And then the next bit is that it takes 3, 4, 5, 6 hours to fully come on. And once you plateau, you have another 10 hours of joy, and after that you just wanted to stop. You just wanted to be over, literally. It doesn't matter how good something is. After 14 hours, nothing's good anymore, really. You just wanted to stop. And then you have another 4 hours if you're unlucky. I had longer ones. And then the aftermath is often also a constipation and things like that. It's just not pleasant. Very healing. It's a beautiful plant, and so I thought, how can we make this more accessible? And once you understand that the bit, it's called mucilages. The bit that's the snotty bit is the same as mucus we have. It's a complex carbohydrate that you can treat in order to get rid of it. It's still in there, but it's not snotty anymore. It loses the way it binds the water, and so then it collapses basically. So the San Pedro that I make is still San Pedro. It's not an extract. It's still San Pedro, but it just takes away the snottiness. Which means when you drink it, it comes on within 15 to 20 minutes, and 3 hours later, you're almost out, which is much more manageable than 18 to 20 hours of tortures, and then you get the whole vegetative side effects. You get headaches and high blood pressure, and you're completely wired, and it doesn't do the plant justice, I find. And I've cooked a lot of San Pedro, and it's difficult to get it into it. So this is a good way of administering it, because it also allows the close proximities of other ceremonies. So so the two medicines on their own are very unique, and I don't know of anyone who actually does any of those this way. But then combining them in the matter of trying to bring them into the balance each other. Also, I don't think there's anyone else. People do maybe both ceremonies in the same weekend, but it's not so much integrated in the way I do it. And the third one, the Iboga, as I said, is interesting because it's usually given to people as the only medicine they ever take, and the first one they ever take. It's definitely not the one I would introduce people to sacred plants with, because you're more likely not to take any sacred plants ever again in your life. So that's it's the worst thing you can do with people. But it's a beautiful medicine if you take it the right way. So what I found with the Iboga, the working with the Iboga, is if you understand why do you need so much Iboga for the experience to actually ignite? And that has to do with your ego. I've seen people who, the Iboga has a completely different approach than the Ayahuasca and the San Pedro. While the Ayahuasca and San Pedro is like a noticeable force. It's almost like a wave clashing against the cliffs. It's like an impact that you can resist against. Whereas the Iboga, I find, has more of a tsunami type of energy. It's not really that forceful, but it's just so much and so sustained in its energy that you can hold up against it for like 12 hours, maybe 24, maybe more. But that once your ego collapses, that's it for the next 3 days. And in order to avoid that, I needed to understand, so what is the purpose of taking that much medicine? It's to break the ego. What if you, instead of breaking it, what if you just shave it off for a few days first? So by giving people ayahuasca in the evening, San Pedro in the morning, no food, no sleep for 3 days prior, and obviously with the plant medicine come effects of emptying their body on both ends as well. So it means after 3 days, you're ready for almost anything. There's nothing much left to resist anything. So the Iboga can march through the open gate, and that means you need much less of the Iboga, which is also, it's an endangered species now. People are poaching Iboga because it's so rare. The Gabon has made an export ban on it, and it's been illegally poached, literally now, because it's almost extinct. Because you need so much. You need 80 to 120 grams of root bark per person. Right? And so if you do big ceremonies, you need kilos of the stuff. And this is the root bark, not even the root or anything. And with the ayahuasca, you cut it and it grows, in a few years grows back. San Pedro, you cut it, it grows back within a few weeks. Iboga, you need the root. if you remove the root from a plant, that's it for the plant, right? The plant won't continue to grow. So sometimes what they do, they harvest half of the roots, but it's a bit tricky. So Iboga is a tricky substance or a tricky plant to work with because of its scarcity and the way it needs to be administered. So with the approach I'm using, you need a fraction of the amount of Iboga to kind of get into the experience, and also it's much more manageable because you're not knocked out of your socks by the Iboga, but you're still fairly conscious while you can go very deep into the experience, and it's actually very pleasurable. I find it's my personal favorite of the three, and that's not because I'm masochist or something, it's actually very pleasant. And because the Iboga then, once you had this, it's a complete reset. And like I said, the experience itself is very difficult to integrate on its own because it is non-dual. You're in a space, and it's very common for people to come out of the Iboga thinking like, wow, that doesn't make any sense at all whatsoever. And this is also why they say with the Ayahuasca San Pedro, your integration time is measured in weeks. With Iboga, it's measured in months. And this is why 1, maybe 2 Iboga a year is a steep program already. You don't want to do more than that. I mean, you can, but I don't think it'll do much. So in order to do that, we prepare the people with the other ceremonies, do the Iboga ceremony at a much reduced rate. I mean, if you do a full-on traditional Iboga in Gabon or in Cameroon, you're out. You have to kind of set aside at least 5 days. It will take you 2 days to be fully on, then you're on for like 3 days, and it will still take you 2 days after that until you can walk without assistance. So that is, if you think you can't go to the toilet on ayahuasca, you don't know what's going to happen on Iboga with you. Seriously, while you're in the peak, there's no way you can go to the toilet. Not even on all fours. I'm telling you cannot go to the toilet. Not that you would want to either. It's quite intense. That's why I said ayahuasca is quite a sweet thing in comparison to that. But it's not necessary to do it like that. If the point is punishment, maybe. But why would you do that? Why would you do that to yourself or to somebody else? So the idea is to be able to bring you into that space without the physical side effects. And I've managed to do that very well with this program. And then in order to round the whole thing off, I almost insist on the final ayahuasca after the Iboga, because while the first ayahuascas, you're already in the cycle, so the first ceremonies you do in a retreat anyway, they're not dealing with your stuff, they're dealing with the surface. The stuff you bring in, the stuff on the superficial things. The first ceremonies, sometimes the first 2 ceremonies, you never get to the actual core of something because you're peeling layers off. So doing 2 ceremonies and then going home and doing 2 ceremonies the next month, you never get anywhere because you keep working on the surface all the time. You never penetrate that. So to come the 3rd day, you come to the actual core of the work, but by that time you're tired, hungry, you want to sleep, you have to share your accommodation with 15 other, not exaggerate. It's like 3 or 4. It's shared accommodation. 3 or 4 other adults, which is something we're not used to, and that's not a normal thing unless it's your partner, your spouse or something, but 3 strangers, one may be snoring or something or do something other annoying. It's part of wearing you down, is this bringing you out of your comfort zone with every tool possible. So by that ayahuasca ceremony, you're already weak and you just want the Iboga to be coming so it's over. So when you come out of the Iboga, we actually feed you 1 meal in order to get your strength back. And the ayahuasca after that is just out of this world because you have your strength back, but you're fully open and fully reset from the Iboga. The Iboga has paved the way for a readiness for an ayahuasca ceremony that you cannot achieve any other way. No fasting, no preparation, maybe a 90-day Vipassana and then do an ayahuasca ceremony. Maybe that would be close to it. But it takes 90 days. I only need 9. So that's the difference. And this way of working is just amazing. So doing the final ayahuasca helps also to integrate and rounds the retreat off. Sometimes we do a sacred cacao ceremony at the end, because once you've been lying for pretty much 9 days straight, most of the time, the cacao helps. We combine it with a Shakti dance, energetic movement to get the energy moving. And that is really, because cacao is also a bit of a difficult one. If you do cacao with people who have never done sacred plants, they might not feel anything from like 30 grams, like an ounce of cacao. That's a bar of chocolate, literally, translate. People might not feel it, but after that type of work, everyone's sensitive enough to really feel. And cacao has a beautiful, beautiful energy. It's very heart opening, similar to the San Pedro, a bit more gentle than the San Pedro. And that constitutes the ceremonies. Are we out of time? Okay.
But we can hang out.
Well, maybe I can come back. Thank you.